Welcome to our brief discussion of the revolt in rural areas and the growth of populism between the Civil War and 1900. We've already seen in the previous lectures the growing split now between the growing cities, rapidly expanding in population and political influence, and the rural agricultural areas. We also see this in terms of industry. It's agriculture against industry. We've seen this throughout U.S. history. We've seen it in the early 19th century between Hamilton and Jefferson on tariff issues. But now this split tends to intensify because of the growing influence of industry and the cities. At this time, the industrialists became very wealthy, as did the large commercial industrial farmers, but many of the small farmers were struggling. The period between the Civil War and 1900, as we saw a couple lectures ago, is characterized in general by falling prices for the crops. So the average farmer is receiving less money for his crop, whether it's a bushel of corn or whatnot. This is caused largely by overproduction. Farmers are becoming much more productive. People in the United States can only eat so much. And exporting really was not the solution because there was more international competition in the world food markets. And as a result, many farmers had increased amount of money they owed both banks and railroads. This is a poster from 1875 from one of the farmer organizations called the Grangers, trying to show the impact of the farmer. In the center, I feed you all, and going around you can see, for instance, on the right it says I sail for all. It's a part of the economy, but the farmer is saying that the farm agriculture is more important than any other sector. Here we see a political cartoon also put out by the Grange, showing the railroad cars, which this is the symbol of monopoly power that's bringing extortion through high prices. The railroad ties, which are the pieces that hold the railroad track together, are called people, and sometimes they're called sleepers by people in the industry. And here they may put in the cartoon farmers who are about to be killed by the train. And again, the cars on the train say extortion, bribery, etc. Now the populace formed local alliances among the farmers to urge political action. And they wanted to regulate the railroads above all. They wanted to tax the wealthy. And they wanted currency inflation. They wanted inflation because by issuing more money, that they thought that would make it easier to repay debts. And as I'm sure you studied in economics, inflation is good for those who own money because you have more money to pay your debts. And it's not good for those who've given the loans. In 1893 was one of the periodic depressions in U.S. history. Every economy in the world goes through periodic depressions, which I'm sure you've studied in economics classes. But this was the worst in U.S. history to that point, and it led really to a climate of class warfare. And a very good example of this is a Pullman strike of 1894. There's an e-reader article about this, and this is when the Pullman Company, which manufactured railroad cars, many of the passenger cars, faced a large strike because the workers were required to live in company-owned houses and buy all their food and everything else in company-owned stores. With less demand for their product, the company fired some workers, but those that it kept on the payroll, it reduced their wages significantly. But unfortunately for the workers, they did not reduce the amount of rent or the price of food, so the workers were really squeezed. And there's an article in the e-reader in this module that you'll be reading, which provides more background. And the populace favored changing the basis of the currency in the United States from gold to silver. At this period, and it changed later, and we'll talk about it later in the course, all currency was gold backed. So if it wasn't a physical gold dollar, let's say it was a dollar bill, the US government had a dollar in gold to back that up. So you could take your $10 or $5 to a bank and they could eventually get you gold. That is not the case today. But the farmers wanted to expand gold to silver because there's only so much gold in the world. It's very expensive. And also the U.S. has a lot of silver, as you know, in Nevada, Colorado, and places. And the result was to expand the money supply, create inflation, and this makes it easier to pay the debts. Now, in 1896, most important election during this period, the Democratic candidate was from the Populist Party, William Jennings Bryan, and he gave a famous speech in which he said that it was absolutely vital to switch from a gold standard to silver, and he stood up and he put his arms out as if he were Jesus Christ on the cross and said, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And this is a very famous political speech. In 1896, again, it was one of the most important elections of this period, very dramatic. In addition to campaigning to change the currency system, he wanted to greatly assist the poor and do that by expanding the federal government to provide such assistance. So this was sort of a dramatic break with previous elections. As you can see here, the election in terms of popular vote was very close. Bryan received 6.5 million votes, and the winning Republican, William McKinley, received 7.1 million. And of course, you win elections in the United States not through popular vote, but through electoral votes. And McKinley clearly had the edge in the electoral vote. But what it shows is the populist William Jennings Bryan, whom we'll see later in the course, was received widespread support. And if you look at the map, the areas that are colored sort of the blue tone color, you can see it runs the entire South, Texas, the Midwest, all the way out. Now, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma were still territories in 1896. They weren't states yet. And right next to where it says Oak, that's Oklahoma territory, they had still Indian territory. That later became part of the state of Oklahoma, which of course helps explain why there are so many people of Indian heritage in Oklahoma. So the populists dropped out at this point as a political force, but its ideas took a certain resonance, and many of their ideas were implemented over the next 20 or 30 years by the progressive movement, which we'll look at in detail later. And this includes the income tax and later vote for women. Thank you very much.